Female SEALs are a joke. Staff Sergeant Ryan Hawthorne spat, his voice dripping with contempt, as he watched the woman adjust her shooting stance at the far end of the range. "Give me that rifle, I'll show you what real marksmanship looks like." What he didn't know was that in less than an hour, he'd be begging that same woman to borrow his weapon, only to watch in stunned silence as she hit 18 moving targets while blindfolded, shattering everything he thought he knew about warfare, and proving that the deadliest sniper on the base had been hiding in plain sight all along. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun blazed mercilessly over Camp Ironclad, a specialized training facility nestled in the unforgiving terrain of the Arizona desert. The base served as the military's premier marksmanship academy, where the finest shooters from every branch came to hone skills that could mean the difference between mission success and body bags. The air shimmered with heat waves rising from the concrete, creating a mirage effect that made distant targets dance like phantoms. At the main rifle range, the crack of gunfire punctuated the desert silence in controlled, rhythmic bursts. This wasn't recreational shooting, this was precision warfare training, where a single missed shot could doom an entire operation. The facility boasted the most advanced shooting ranges in the military arsenal, 1,000-yard precision courses, moving target systems, and environmental simulation chambers that could replicate combat conditions from urban warfare to Arctic operations. Among the shooters that morning was someone who appeared to belong to none of these elite circles. Dr. Samantha Rivers stood at lane 7, her petite frame dwarfed by the massive Barrett .50 caliber rifle she was attempting to operate. At 5'4" and barely 120 pounds, she looked like a librarian who'd wandered onto a battlefield by mistake. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and wire-rimmed glasses sat perched on her nose. She wore standard civilian range attire, khaki pants, and a plain blue polo shirt bearing the logo of Tactical Solutions Incorporated, a defense contractor specializing in ballistics research. To every observer, Dr. Rivers was exactly what her credentials claimed: a mild-mannered ballistics analyst with a PhD in applied physics from MIT, contracted by the Pentagon to evaluate new sniper rifle systems. Her job was to test equipment, not to use it operationally. She was supposed to fire controlled shots at stationary targets, record data on accuracy and recoil patterns, and submit technical reports that would help procurement officers make purchasing decisions. What none of them knew was that Dr. Samantha Rivers had been dead for 3 years. The woman wearing her identity had assumed the cover so completely that even the most thorough background check would confirm her academic credentials, her employment history, and her security clearance. The real Samantha Rivers had been a genuine ballistics expert who died in a car accident in California. The woman who now bore her name had arranged the identity transfer through channels so classified that only a handful of people in the entire intelligence community knew they existed. Staff Sergeant Ryan Hawthorne represented everything wrong with the old guard military mentality. At 35, he was a career Marine sniper with 2 tours in Afghanistan and 1 in Iraq. His service record was impressive: 47 confirmed kills, 3 Purple Hearts, and a Navy Cross for extraordinary heroism during a firefight in Helmand Province. His chest bore the ribbons and badges that marked him as elite Marine scout sniper, advanced marksmanship instructor, expert rifleman. But Hawthorne's success had bred a toxic arrogance that poisoned every interaction. He believed that warfare was a man's profession, that women were a dangerous distraction in combat units, and that the military's recent integration policies were politically motivated experiments that would get real soldiers killed. He voiced these opinions loudly and frequently, particularly when alcohol loosened whatever minimal filter he possessed. This morning, Hawthorne was running a training session for junior marksmen, a mix of Army Rangers, Marine snipers, and Navy SEALs who'd been selected for advanced precision shooting courses. His students hung on his every word, not just because of his expertise, but because of his reputation for crushing anyone who disappointed him. "Listen up, ladies," Hawthorne barked at his all-male class, the term ladies delivered as the ultimate insult. Precision shooting isn't about fancy equipment or computer calculations. It's about warrior instinct, developed through years of life and death situations. It's about having the stones to pull the trigger when everything's on the line. He gestured dismissively toward where Samantha was working. "Some people think you can learn this stuff from textbooks, think a PhD makes you a shooter. That's civilian thinking. And civilian thinking gets Marines killed." 20 yards away, Samantha methodically worked through her assigned test protocol, seemingly oblivious to Hawthorne's commentary. She fired single shots at paper targets, paused to record measurements, adjusted the rifle's scope, and repeated the process. Her movements were precise but unremarkable, exactly what a researcher would do when evaluating equipment performance. What Hawthorne couldn't see from his position was the grouping she was achieving. Every shot landed within a 2-inch circle at 800 yards, a level of consistency that even experienced snipers found difficult to maintain. Her breathing was perfectly controlled, her trigger pull flawlessly smooth, and her position so stable that she might have been carved from stone. Master Gunnery Sergeant William Bull Morrison supervised the range operations from the control tower, a glass-enclosed booth that provided oversight of all shooting lanes. At 58, Morrison had seen everything the Marine Corps had to offer. He'd served in Beirut in 1983, Panama in 1989, the Gulf War, Somalia, Iraq, and Afghanistan. He'd trained 3 generations of Marine snipers and had developed an eye for recognizing exceptional talent. Morrison had been watching Dr. Rivers for 3 weeks now. Ever since she'd arrived at Camp Ironclad, something about her didn't add up. Her shooting stance was textbook perfect. But it was the wrong textbook. She used the modified prone position favored by special operations units, not the standard technique taught to civilian marksmanship enthusiasts. Her breathing pattern followed military protocols. Most tellingly, she unconsciously performed counter-surveillance sweeps, checking her 6 o'clock position in a pattern that suggested years of ingrained tactical training. Morrison had run her name through every database he could access. Dr. Samantha Rivers checked out completely academic transcripts, employment history, even college roommate testimonials. But Morrison trusted his instincts more than paperwork, and his instincts were screaming that this woman was far more than she appeared. The morning session progressed with Hawthorne demonstrating various shooting positions to his students, while maintaining a running commentary about military standards versus civilian pretensions. His group fired at targets ranging from 300 to 1,000 yards, with Hawthorne consistently achieving kill shots that earned appreciative murmurs from his audience. "See that grouping?" Hawthorne called out after placing 5 rounds within a 6-inch circle at 800 yards. "That's what separates warriors from wannabes. That's what you get from real trigger time in real combat situations." As if summoned by his boasting, Colonel Patricia Steele approached the range. At 43, Steele was the commanding officer of Camp Ironclad and one of the few women to achieve field-grade rank in the combat arms branches. Her path to command had been brutal, every promotion questioned, every decision scrutinized, every mistake magnified by those who believed women had no place in combat leadership. Colonel Steele had earned her position through a combination of exceptional competence and political savvy, but she knew that one significant failure could end not just her career, but set back women's military integration by decades. She walked with the measured stride of someone who had learned to project authority in environments designed to challenge it. "Sergeant Hawthorne," she said, her voice cutting through the desert air with parade ground precision. "How are the students progressing?" Hawthorne came to attention, his salute crisp despite his barely concealed resentment. He'd made his feelings about female officers clear on multiple occasions, always carefully phrased to avoid direct insubordination. but leaving no doubt about his position. "Excellent progress, ma'am. The men are adapting well to advanced techniques. Real warrior training produces real results." The emphasis on men and real warrior wasn't subtle, but it wasn't quite insubordinate either. Steele had heard variations of this speech from Hawthorne dozens of times. He was testing her, probing for reactions, looking for evidence to support his belief that women were too emotional for command positions. "I'm sure they are," Steele replied evenly. "I trust you're maintaining the high standards this facility is known for." She turned toward the civilian testing area where Samantha continued her methodical work. "How is our contractor progressing with the Barrett evaluation?" "Hard to say, ma'am," Hawthorne said, his tone suggesting he couldn't care less. "She's following her checklist, firing at paper, recording numbers. Typical civilian approach, all theory, no real application." Morrison watched this exchange from his control tower, noting the subtle dynamics at play. Hawthorne was performing for his students, demonstrating his resistance to female authority while maintaining plausible deniability. Colonel Steele was managing the situation with professional restraint, but Morrison could see the tension in her shoulders. What none of them noticed was that Samantha had stopped shooting and was listening to every word of their conversation. Her hearing had been enhanced through years of training to detect threats in complex audio environments. She could track multiple conversations simultaneously while maintaining focus on her primary task. The stage was being set for a confrontation that would expose truths none of them were prepared to face. In this environment of military machismo and institutional bias, the deadliest operator on the entire base was about to reveal herself in a display of marksmanship that would redefine everyone's understanding of what was possible. The desert sun climbed higher, the heat grew more intense, and the tension continued to build toward a moment that would shatter assumptions and change lives forever. "Doctor," Samantha Rivers adjusted her wire-rimmed glasses and made another notation in her ballistics journal, her handwriting neat and precise. To any casual observer, she was exactly what she appeared to be. A mild-mannered academic, fulfilling a routine equipment evaluation contract. But beneath this carefully constructed facade lay secrets that would have sent shockwaves through the highest levels of military intelligence. Her real name was Captain Alexandra "Ghost" Thorne, and she was part of an experimental program so classified that it didn't officially exist. Project Shadow Strike had been conceived in the aftermath of failed operations where male operators couldn't penetrate certain targets due to cultural restrictions in Middle Eastern theaters. The program recruited women from various elite units, Delta Force, Navy SEALs, Marine Force Recon, and CIA Special Activities Division, and trained them in deep cover operations. Alexandra had been handpicked from SEAL Team 6 after achieving something unprecedented. She'd become the first woman to complete Hell Week with a perfect performance score. Not just passing, excelling beyond every male candidate in her class. Her instructors had initially attributed her success to luck or lowered standards. Until they reviewed the actual metrics, she'd outperformed seasoned operators in marksmanship, underwater demolition, land navigation, and tactical planning. But her true gift wasn't just physical capability, it was her ability to become invisible in plain sight. Where other operators relied on camouflage and concealment, Alexandra could hide in the most exposed locations, simply by becoming what people expected to see. She'd spent 2 years perfecting the Dr. Rivers persona, studying ballistics research until she could discuss muzzle velocity, coefficients, and barrel harmonics with genuine expertise. The academic credentials weren't fabricated, she'd actually completed the coursework through an accelerated CIA education program, earning her PhD through a combination of night classes and online studies while deployed. The agency had arranged for her to attend lectures via secure video link from safe houses in Kabul and Baghdad. She'd written her dissertation on atmospheric effects on long-range ballistic trajectories while conducting actual sniper operations in Syria. Now, 3 weeks into her mission at Camp Ironclad, she was growing frustrated with the assignment's parameters. Her handlers had placed her here to investigate suspected security breaches. Someone was leaking classified marksmanship techniques to foreign intelligence services. Advanced shooting methods developed at Camp Ironclad had appeared in the hands of enemy snipers in 3 different theaters, costing American lives. The investigation required her to maintain perfect cover while conducting surveillance on personnel with access to sensitive training protocols. She had to endure daily condescension from instructors who assumed she knew nothing about weapons, while secretly photographing classified documents and recording conversations that might expose the traitor in their midst. The most difficult part wasn't the technical aspects of the mission, it was the psychological toll of being constantly underestimated and dismissed. Alexandra had spent her entire career fighting for recognition in male-dominated environments, proving herself repeatedly only to have new doubts raised with each assignment. At Camp Ironclad, she'd regressed to being treated like a bumbling amateur, and the strain was beginning to show in subtle ways. Her morning routine revealed the discipline hidden beneath her academic disguise. She woke at 0430 hours, 30 minutes before the base came alive. In the privacy of her temporary quarters, she completed a modified version of the Navy SEAL physical training regimen. 500 push-ups, 500 sit-ups, and a series of yoga poses designed to maintain flexibility without building visible muscle mass that might compromise her cover. She'd learned to be careful about her physical appearance. Too much muscle definition would raise questions about a ballistics researcher's fitness level. She wore loose-fitting clothing to conceal her athletic build, and had taught herself to walk with the slightly forward-leaning posture of someone who spent long hours hunched over academic texts. Her equipment told a different story to those trained to read such signs. The ballistics notebook she carried was legitimate, filled with genuine calculations and observations. But the pen she used was a tactical writing instrument with a hidden compartment containing micro cameras. Her civilian range bag held standard ballistics equipment, but the laptop computer she used for data analysis was running sophisticated intelligence-gathering software disguised as statistical programs. Most revealing were the subtle modifications she'd made to her assigned workspace. She'd positioned her testing station to provide maximum visual coverage of the range while appearing to focus on her targets. Her chair was angled to allow her to monitor the entrance and exit points. She'd even arranged her equipment in a way that forced anyone approaching to come from her strong side angle, where she could react most effectively to threats. These weren't conscious decisions, they were the result of years of training that had become instinctive. Alexandra couldn't help but conduct surveillance and threat assessment any more than she could stop breathing. Her mind automatically cataloged every person on the range, tracking their movements, noting their weapons and potential capabilities. She'd identified 17 different security vulnerabilities in the facility's layout within her first week. The perimeter sensors had blind spots that could be exploited. The armory access protocols were insufficient for the level of sensitive equipment stored there. Most concerning, the classified training materials were secured with locks that she could defeat in under 90 seconds using tools available in any hardware store. But the human element posed the greatest security risk. Staff Sergeant Hawthorne's personal prejudices made him predictable and therefore exploitable. His need to demonstrate superiority over anyone he perceived as weak created operational blind spots that enemy agents could manipulate. An attractive female operative could potentially extract classified information from him simply by appearing impressed with his expertise. Colonel Steele represented a different kind of vulnerability. Her position made her a high-value intelligence target, but her defensive posture regarding women's military integration created isolation that could be exploited. She was fighting on too many fronts, defending her command decisions, proving her competence, and managing personnel like Hawthorne who barely concealed their insubordination. Master Gunnery Sergeant Morrison was the wild card. His experience and instincts made him the most dangerous person on the base from an operational security perspective. Alexandra had caught him observing her on multiple occasions, and his body language suggested growing suspicion about her true identity. She'd begun varying her routines to avoid creating patterns he might recognize as tactical training. The morning's shooting session was proceeding according to her carefully planned schedule when she detected a shift in the range dynamics. Hawthorne was building toward one of his characteristic displays of military superiority, using her presence as a prop to reinforce his lessons about warrior mentality versus civilian weakness. She'd anticipated this moment and had prepared for it carefully. Her marksmanship demonstration had been deliberately mediocre, good enough to suggest competence with firearms, but unremarkable enough to avoid drawing attention. She'd been missing shots intentionally, creating groupings that suggested academic understanding of ballistics theory without practical expertise. The irony wasn't lost on her. She was one of the finest marksmen in the American military, capable of placing rounds with precision that bordered on supernatural, and she was spending her days pretending to struggle with basic shooting fundamentals. Her SEAL instructors had nicknamed her Ghost, not just for her ability to move unseen, but for her capacity to make impossible shots hitting targets through minimal gaps, around obstacles, in adverse weather conditions that would defeat lesser shooters. Her personal record was a confirmed kill at 2,847 meters using a Barrett .50 caliber rifle, a shot that had required calculating wind drift, temperature variations, altitude effects, and the rotation of the Earth itself. She'd eliminated a high-value target in Afghanistan who'd been directing attacks against American forces, firing from a mountain position in conditions that other snipers had declared impossible. That same rifle now sat before her on the bench, and she was pretending to struggle with targets at 800 meters. The cognitive dissonance was maddening, but necessary. Her mission required patience, observation, and the ability to endure humiliation without revealing her true capabilities. As Hawthorne's voice grew louder and more condescending, Alexandra felt the familiar tension building in her shoulders. She'd learned to channel anger into focus, transforming frustration into deadly precision. Every insult, every dismissive comment, every assumption about her limitations was being stored away like ammunition, waiting for the moment when she could finally reveal who she really was. That moment was approaching faster than anyone realized. The morning's events were building toward a confrontation that would expose truths none of them were prepared to face. In this environment of institutional bias and military tradition, the deadliest sniper in the facility was about to emerge from the shadows in a display of skill that would redefine everyone's understanding of what was possible. The desert heat continued to rise, creating thermals that would challenge even experienced marksmen. But Alexandra thrived in difficult conditions. She'd learned to read wind patterns by watching dust devils form in the distance, to calculate temperature effects by feeling the expansion of metal components, to compensate for atmospheric distortion by understanding the physics that most shooters only guessed at. Soon, very soon, she would stop pretending to be Dr. Samantha Rivers and show them exactly what Captain Alexandra "Ghost" Thorne could do with a rifle. Staff Sergeant Ryan Hawthorne commanded attention like a force of nature. At 6'2", with the broad shoulders of a linebacker and the weathered face of someone who'd spent years squinting through rifle scopes in hostile territory, he embodied everything the Marine Corps marketed in its recruitment campaigns. His dress uniform bore the weight of genuine accomplishment, combat ribbons earned through blood and bullets, marksmanship badges that represented thousands of hours of training, and the coveted scout sniper insignia that marked him as elite among the elite. But beneath the impressive exterior lay a festering resentment that had grown more toxic with each passing year. Hawthorne had joined the Marines in 2008, during the height of the Iraq surge, when the Corps was still an exclusively male brotherhood bound by shared hardship and mutual sacrifice. He'd earned his place in that brotherhood through Hell Week, sniper school, and 3 combat deployments where he'd proven his worth under fire. Now, 15 years later, that brotherhood was changing, in ways that challenged everything he believed about military service. Women were being integrated into combat roles. Diversity initiatives were reshaping promotion criteria, and social media was giving voice to critics who questioned the warrior culture that had defined his identity since boot camp. Hawthorne's worldview was simple and inflexible. Combat effectiveness depended on unit cohesion. Unit cohesion required absolute trust, and absolute trust could only exist between warriors who'd proven themselves under identical conditions. Women, by virtue of different physical standards and what he saw as special accommodations, couldn't meet that threshold. Their presence in combat units was a politically motivated experiment that would ultimately cost Marine lives. This morning, he was conducting advanced marksmanship training for 12 hand-picked shooters, Army Rangers, Marine snipers, and Navy SEALs who'd already demonstrated exceptional skill and were being prepared for specialized missions. These were his kind of Marines, disciplined, focused, and uncompromising in their pursuit of perfection. Precision shooting, Hawthorne announced, his voice carrying across the range with parade ground authority, is the intersection of science and warrior spirit. You can calculate wind speed, atmospheric pressure, and temperature variations all day long. But when it matters, when lives depend on your shot, it's the warrior inside you that makes the difference. He gestured toward the 1,000-meter targets that shimmered in the desert heat. At this distance, you're not just fighting physics, you're fighting doubt, fatigue, and the voice in your head that says maybe you're not good enough. That voice kills Marines. Your job is to silence it. Corporal Danny Razor McKenzie, a Marine sniper with 2 tours in Syria, raised his hand. Sergeant, what about the new integrated training protocols? Are we going to be working with mixed units in the field? The question hung in the air like smoke from a misfired round. Hawthorne's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, a tell that his students had learned to recognize as a warning sign. Corporal McKenzie, Hawthorne said, his tone dropping several degrees. Your job is to put rounds on target. Let the politicians worry about social engineering. Focus on what matters. Can you make the shot when it counts? But McKenzie persisted, either missing the warning or choosing to ignore it. I'm just saying, Sergeant, if we're going to be deployed with female snipers, shouldn't we understand their capabilities and limitations? Hawthorne's expression shifted from irritation to something approaching contempt. This was the opening he'd been waiting for, a chance to educate these young Marines about the realities of combat before political correctness got them killed. Female snipers, he said, loading the words with disdain. Let me tell you about female snipers, Marines. The Israelis tried it. The Soviets tried. Even the Canadians gave it a shot. You know what they learned? Biology doesn't care about politics. He began pacing in front of his students, building momentum like a preacher warming to his sermon. A male Marine carries a base load of 240 rounds of ammunition, plus water, medical supplies, and communications equipment. That's 85 pounds of gear before we add mission-specific equipment. A female Marine, assuming she can carry the same load, which is already questionable, has to do it with 30% less muscle mass and bone density. Sergeant First Class Maria Santos, an Army Ranger qualified sniper, shifted uncomfortably but said nothing. She was one of only 3 women in the class and had learned to pick her battles carefully. But let's say she makes it to the objective. Hawthorne continued, his voice gaining intensity. Let's say she's in position with a clear shot. Do you know what the maximum effective range of an M110 sniper rifle is in the hands of an average male operator versus an average female operator? He paused dramatically, surveying his audience. It's not about the rifle, Marines. It's about the platform. A 180-pound male can absorb recoil and maintain target acquisition in ways that a 130-pound female simply cannot. Physics doesn't care about your feelings. Private First Class Tommy Chen, a Navy SEAL fresh from sniper school, ventured a question. But Sergeant, what about psychological factors? Stress management, target identification, tactical planning? Isn't there more to sniping than just physical strength? Hawthorne's smile was predatory. Good question, Private Chen. Let's talk about psychological factors. Combat stress affects everyone, but it affects women differently. Higher baseline cortisol levels, greater emotional volatility, monthly hormonal fluctuations that can impact decision-making. These aren't opinions, they're medical facts. He pointed toward Alexandra, who continued her methodical target practice 50 meters away, apparently oblivious to the discussion. Look at our contractor over there. Dr. Rivers, ballistics expert, PhD from MIT. Brilliant woman, I'm sure. But watch her shoot. Textbook stance. Proper breathing. Excellent equipment. And what's her grouping at 800 meters? 6 inches on a good day. Several students turned to observe Alexandra's shooting, noting the neat but unremarkable groupings she was producing. Hawthorne had timed his lecture perfectly. She was currently struggling with a series of shots that were hitting low and to the left, exactly what an inexperienced shooter might produce when fighting recoil anticipation. See that low left pattern? Hawthorne continued. Classic female shooter error. Overcompensation for perceived recoil. Inadequate follow-through. She's thinking too much, trying to engineer her way through what should be instinctive. That's the difference between academic understanding and warrior intuition. Master Gunnery Sergeant Morrison watched this performance from his control tower with growing unease. He'd seen Hawthorne conduct similar demonstrations before, always using carefully selected examples to reinforce his prejudices. The man was an excellent instructor when it came to technical skills, but his social attitudes were becoming increasingly problematic in a rapidly evolving military. Morrison's concerns weren't just philosophical. He'd received multiple informal complaints about Hawthorne's teaching methods, particularly from female personnel who felt targeted and humiliated by his classroom approach. Colonel Steele had made it clear that any documented incidents of discrimination would result in immediate disciplinary action, but Hawthorne was skilled at walking the line between aggressive instruction and actionable harassment. The bottom line, Hawthorne announced, building toward his conclusion, is that precision shooting is a warrior's discipline. It requires not just technical skill, but the mental toughness that comes from knowing you've earned your place through the same trials as every Marine who came before you. When standards get adjusted, when exceptions get made, when politics override performance, that's when Marines die. He paused, letting his words sink in. I'm not saying women can't contribute to the Corps. They can serve with honor in roles suited to their capabilities. But when it comes to putting steel on target in combat conditions, when American lives depend on making an impossible shot under extreme stress, that's when you need a warrior, not a scientist, not a politician, a warrior. The students absorbed this lesson with varying degrees of comfort. Some nodded in agreement, having heard similar arguments throughout their careers. Others looked uncertain, caught between respect for Hawthorne's combat experience and discomfort with his sweeping generalizations. What none of them knew was that every word of Hawthorne's lecture was being recorded by sophisticated audio equipment hidden in Alexandra's ballistics kit. Her mission included gathering evidence of discriminatory practices that might be contributing to security vulnerabilities, and Hawthorne was providing a masterclass in exactly the kind of thinking that could be exploited by enemy intelligence services. As the morning progressed, Hawthorne continued his demonstration, calling individual students forward to attempt increasingly difficult shots. He provided expert coaching, correcting stance and breathing techniques with the authority of someone who'd made similar shots in combat. His technical instruction was flawless. It was his social commentary that revealed the toxic undercurrents threatening operational security. Mackenzie, you're pulling left again. Combat breathing, Marine 4 counts in, 4 counts hold, 4 counts out. Your heartbeat is interfering with your natural point of aim. Santos, better follow through. But your position is too rigid. You're fighting the rifle, instead of becoming one with it. Relax into the shot sequence. Chen, Excellent windage calculation. You're learning to read environmental conditions instead of just relying on instruments. That's what separates snipers from shooters. Each correction was delivered with professional competence, but Hawthorne's praise was noticeably more enthusiastic for his male students. He spent more time coaching them, offered more detailed explanations, and celebrated their successes more visibly. The pattern was subtle but consistent, exactly the kind of unconscious bias that could undermine unit cohesion and operational effectiveness. As the session approached its midpoint, Hawthorne was feeling increasingly confident about his message. His students were responding positively to his instruction. The morning's shooting had proceeded without incident, and he'd managed to reinforce important lessons about military standards without crossing any lines that might trigger administrative action. He had no idea that his carefully constructed worldview was about to collide with reality in ways that would shatter his assumptions and force him to confront truths he'd spent years refusing to acknowledge. The woman he'd been using as an example of civilian limitations was preparing to reveal capabilities that would redefine his understanding of what was possible. The stage was set for a confrontation that would expose not just his prejudices, but the dangerous blind spots they created in an environment where American lives depended on accurate threat assessment and tactical superiority. The confrontation began with something as simple as spilled coffee. Alexandra had been tracking the morning's dynamics carefully, noting the increasing tension in Hawthorne's voice as he built toward what she recognized as a calculated performance designed to reinforce his beliefs about female military capability. She'd encountered dozens of men like him throughout her career, competent operators, whose professional skills were compromised by personal prejudices that created exploitable weaknesses in unit cohesion. She was adjusting her rifle scope for the next series of test shots when Private Chen approached her position carrying 2 cups of coffee from the range's break area. The young SEAL was clearly uncomfortable with Hawthorne's lecture and seemed to be looking for an excuse to distance himself from the increasingly uncomfortable classroom atmosphere. "Dr. Rivers," Chen said quietly, offering her one of the cups. "Thought you might want some coffee. It's going to be a long morning." Alexandra accepted the gesture gracefully, recognizing it as an act of kindness from someone who'd been raised to treat others with basic courtesy regardless of their apparent status. "Thank you, Private. That's very thoughtful." Chen lingered for a moment, watching her methodical approach to target practice. "Ma'am, can I ask you something?" "About ballistics theory." "Of course." Alexandra kept her voice in the mild, academic tone she'd perfected for the Dr. Rivers persona. The sergeant was talking about platform stability and recoil management. From a physics perspective, wouldn't technique and body positioning matter more than raw mass when it comes to controlling a rifle? It was an intelligent question that demonstrated Chen was thinking critically about Hawthorne's oversimplified explanations. Alexandra felt a brief surge of respect for the young operator, but she had to respond as a ballistics researcher, not as someone with extensive combat shooting experience. "Well," she began carefully, "the relationship between shooter mass and recoil absorption is complex. While it's true that a heavier shooter can absorb more kinetic energy, proper technique can compensate for significant mass differences. Bone structure, muscle density, and training methodology all play important roles in Chen." Hawthorne's voice cut across the range like a whip crack. "What did I tell you about fraternizing with contractors during training time?" "Get back here." The young SEAL's face flushed with embarrassment. He'd been caught showing interest in a civilian's opinion, which Hawthorne would undoubtedly interpret as a sign of weakness or confusion about proper military hierarchy. Chen hurried back toward the group, leaving Alexandra alone with her coffee and a growing sense that the morning's tensions were building toward an inevitable collision. As Chen rejoined the class, Hawthorne's expression darkened with the particular anger of an instructor whose authority had been questioned, however indirectly. He'd spent 20 minutes explaining why civilian academic knowledge was inferior to warrior experience, and now one of his students was seeking advice from the very person he'd been using as a negative example. "Ladies and gentlemen," Hawthorne announced, his voice heavy with sarcasm, It appears we have a communication breakdown. Private Chen seems to think our ballistics expert might have something valuable to contribute to our discussion about precision shooting. Let's test that theory. Alexandra felt the shift in atmosphere immediately. The casual morning training session was transforming into something more dangerous, a public challenge designed to humiliate her while reinforcing Hawthorne's authority over his students. She'd seen this pattern before in other contexts, and she knew that her response would determine whether the situation escalated or diffused. "Dr. Rivers," Hawthorne called out, his tone artificially polite in a way that made his intentions clear. "Since you've been eavesdropping on our discussion about marksmanship fundamentals, perhaps you'd like to share your academic perspective with the class?" Every person on the range turned to watch this exchange. Alexandra carefully set down her coffee cup and faced Hawthorne across the 50 meters that separated their positions. She could feel Master Gunnery Sergeant Morrison's attention from the control tower, could sense Colonel Steele's presence as the base commander approached from the parking area. "I wouldn't want to interrupt your instruction, Sergeant Hawthorne," Alexandra replied, keeping her voice professionally neutral. "I'm just here to evaluate equipment performance." "Oh, but I insist," Hawthorne said, his smile predatory. "We're always interested in learning from experts. Tell us, Dr. Rivers, what's your assessment of effective range limitations for precision rifle systems when operated by personnel of different physical specifications?" The question was loaded with landmines. Any answer she gave would either validate his prejudices or set her up for public embarrassment. Alexandra recognized this as a no-win scenario, carefully constructed to reinforce his authority while discrediting her credibility. "Effective range depends on numerous variables," she said carefully. "Environmental conditions, ammunition quality, scope, calibration, and operator training all factor into the equation. Physical characteristics are just one component among many." "Operator training," Hawthorne repeated, seizing on the phrase. "Interesting perspective. And how much operator training do you have, Dr. Rivers? How many rounds have you fired in combat conditions?" The trap was closing. Alexandra could deflect the question, but doing so would appear evasive and validate his point about civilian inexperience. She could lie about her background, but any false claims could be verified and would compromise her cover. Or she could tell a carefully edited version of the truth. "My experience is primarily academic," she said, which was technically accurate if incomplete. "I focus on theoretical applications rather than practical implementation." Theoretical applications. Hawthorne savored the words. "Class, this is exactly what I've been trying to teach you about the difference between classroom knowledge and warrior experience. Dr. Rivers has studied ballistics extensively. She can probably calculate muzzle velocity coefficients in her sleep. But when it comes to putting steel on target, when lives depend on it, when stress and fatigue and adrenaline are clouding your judgment, that's when theory meets reality." He began walking toward her position, his students following behind like a pack of predators sensing weakness. "Tell me, Dr. Rivers, what's your personal best grouping at 1,000 meters? Not theoretical actual performance under field conditions." Alexandra felt the familiar tightness in her chest that preceded combat stress reactions. Not because she was afraid of Hawthorne, but because maintaining her cover required her to appear weak and incompetent in front of professionals whose respect she'd earned through years of superior performance. Every instinct screamed at her to demonstrate her true capabilities, to show these Marines what a real operator looked like. Instead, she had to play the role of an awkward academic who'd never faced serious challenges. I don't typically shoot at that distance, Sergeant. My testing protocols focus on shorter ranges with controlled conditions." "Controlled conditions," Hawthorne repeated, his voice dripping with contempt. "Of course they do, because that's how academics approach problems, by eliminating variables until the situation becomes manageable. But combat isn't controllable, Dr. Rivers. Combat is chaos. Combat is equipment failure, and impossible weather and targets that shoot back. By now, Colonel Steele had arrived at the edge of the range and was observing the interaction with growing concern. She'd dealt with Hawthorne's attitude problems before, but this public confrontation with a civilian contractor was crossing lines that could create serious administrative complications. "Sergeant Hawthorne," Steele called out, her command voice cutting across the range. "Is there a problem here?" Hawthorne snapped to attention, his vivid expression shifting to the carefully neutral mask that subordinates used when addressing superior officers they didn't respect. "No problem, ma'am. Just conducting an informal knowledge exchange with our ballistics consultant." The phrase, informal knowledge exchange, was military speak for public humiliation, and everyone present understood the subtext. Colonel Steele was faced with a difficult choice: intervene and potentially validate claims that female officers were too protective of other women, or allow the situation to continue and risk having a civilian contractor file a harassment complaint. "I see," Steele said carefully. "Dr. Rivers, are you finding this exchange helpful for your research?" Alexandra recognized the lifeline being offered. She could accept Colonel Steele's protection, claim that Hawthorne was interfering with her work, and retreat to the safety of official intervention. It would end the confrontation and preserve her cover identity, but it would also validate every assumption Hawthorne had made about female capability in challenging situations. His students would learn that women needed protection from aggressive males, that they couldn't handle direct confrontation, that they were fundamentally unsuited for the warrior culture that defined elite military units. "Actually, Colonel," Alexandra said, making a decision that would change everything. "The sergeant raises interesting points about the relationship between theoretical knowledge and practical application. Perhaps there's a way to test some of these concepts empirically?" The words hung in the desert air like a challenge thrown down at a medieval tournament. Hawthorne's eyes narrowed as he processed the implications. His students shifted uncomfortably, sensing that the morning's routine training session was transforming into something unprecedented. Master Gunnery Sergeant Morrison leaned forward in his control tower, his instincts screaming that he was about to witness something extraordinary. Colonel Steele felt a chill of premonition, recognizing that whatever happened next would have consequences far beyond a simple training exercise. And Alexandra, Ghost Thorne, felt the familiar calm that preceded moments when her true nature would be revealed, when years of training and sacrifice would be distilled into a few crucial seconds that would define how she was remembered. The stage was set for a demonstration that would shatter assumptions and reveal truths that none of them were prepared to accept. The proposition hung in the air like the moment before lightning strikes. Colonel Steele found herself caught between competing pressures that threatened to tear apart the carefully maintained balance she'd spent years constructing. On one side stood Staff Sergeant Hawthorne, a decorated combat veteran whose expertise was undeniable, but whose attitudes represented everything backward about military culture. On the other side was Dr. Rivers, a civilian contractor whose presence on the base was governed by strict protocols and whose treatment could reflect on Steele's leadership abilities. More troubling was the growing audience. Word of the confrontation had spread through the base's informal communication network with the speed that only military gossip could achieve. Personnel from other training areas were finding excuses to wander past the rifle range. Officers were emerging from administrative buildings to observe the unusual spectacle of a civilian challenging a Marine instructor. Master Gunnery Sergeant Morrison descended from his control tower with the deliberate pace of someone who'd learned to read dangerous situations through 3 decades of military service. His weathered face betrayed no emotion, but his pale eyes were alert to nuances that others might miss. He'd seen enough confrontations to know that this one was teetering on the edge of something that could either diffuse tensions or explode into a career-ending incident for multiple people. "Colonel," Morrison said, his voice carrying the quiet authority that senior enlisted personnel wielded when speaking truth to power. "Perhaps we should consider the implications of whatever's being proposed here. We have training schedules to maintain and safety protocols to observe. It was a diplomatic way of saying that allowing a civilian contractor to engage in some kind of marksmanship competition with a combat instructor was potentially catastrophic from multiple perspectives. If Dr. Rivers performed poorly, it would validate Hawthorne's prejudices and potentially humiliate a Pentagon contractor. If she performed well, it would raise uncomfortable questions about why a ballistics researcher possessed advanced shooting skills. Colonel Steele understood the subtext perfectly. Morrison was offering her an escape route, a way to shut down the situation before it spiraled beyond control. She could cite safety concerns, invoke training regulations, or simply order everyone back to their assigned duties. It would be the safe choice, the politically smart choice, the kind of decision that protected careers and maintained the status quo. But Steele had spent her entire career fighting against the assumption that women needed protection from challenging situations. Every time she'd chosen the safe path, every time she'd avoided confrontation or declined difficult assignments, she'd reinforced the belief that female officers lacked the courage and decisiveness required for combat leadership. "What exactly are you proposing, Dr. Rivers?" Steele asked. Her tone carefully neutral but her body language indicating she was prepared to listen. Alexandra felt the weight of multiple gazes focused on her as she formulated her response. Every word would be analyzed and remembered, potentially forming the foundation for reports that could reach the highest levels of military leadership. She needed to appear confident without seeming arrogant, knowledgeable without revealing expertise that would compromise her cover. "Well," she began, adopting the measured tone of an academic proposing a research hypothesis, "Sergeant Hawthorne has raised interesting questions about the relationship between theoretical knowledge and practical performance. It might be instructive to conduct a controlled comparison, sort of a field experiment, to test some of the variables we've been discussing." Hawthorne's predatory smile widened. This was exactly what he'd hoped, for an opportunity to demonstrate civilian inadequacy in front of witnesses, thereby reinforcing his lessons about warrior superiority, while humiliating someone who'd challenged his authority. "I'm listening," he said, his tone suggesting he was about to enjoy whatever came next. "Perhaps a shooting competition," Alexandra continued, maintaining her academic demeanor while internally calculating the risks and opportunities. "Nothing elaborate, just a straightforward comparison of marksmanship performance under controlled conditions. We could test various distances, target types, environmental factors, gather some empirical data about the theoretical concepts you've been explaining to your students." The suggestion sent ripples of excitement through the growing audience. Military personnel were naturally competitive, and the prospect of watching a decorated combat instructor compete against a civilian contractor was irresistible entertainment. But those with more experience recognized the potential complications. Morrison stepped closer to Colonel Steele, his voice low but audible to those nearby. "Ma'am, I need to point out that civilian contractors aren't authorized for competitive shooting activities without specific safety certifications and insurance waivers. Additionally, Sergeant Hawthorne's status as an instructor creates liability issues if he's perceived as engaging in hazing or harassment activities." The legal and administrative obstacles were real and significant. Military bases operated under strict regulations governing civilian access to weapons and training facilities. What was being proposed could violate multiple policies and create paperwork nightmares that would follow everyone involved through their careers. But Hawthorne was already committed to the confrontation and unwilling to back down in front of his students and peers. "Colonel, with respect, ma'am, this sounds like an educational opportunity. Dr. Rivers wants to understand practical marksmanship applications. I'm willing to provide instruction. We can frame it as a training exercise rather than a competition." The distinction was important, but largely semantic. Everyone understood that regardless of the official terminology, what would happen next would be a direct comparison of capabilities with clear winners and losers. Hawthorne was confident about the outcome. He'd spent years perfecting his shooting skills under combat conditions, while Dr. Rivers was an academic whose rifle experience was limited to controlled research environments. Private Chen raised his hand tentatively. "Sergeant, what would the parameters be? Distance, target type, scoring methodology?" It was a good question that forced everyone to consider the practical details of what was being proposed. Hawthorne had been thinking in general terms about demonstrating superiority, but a fair comparison required specific criteria and measurable outcomes. "Standard precision shooting protocols," Hawthorne said, his confidence growing as he considered the technical aspects. "Multiple distances 600, 800, and 1,000 meters. Paper targets with defined scoring rings. Best groupings win at each distance. We'll use identical weapons and ammunition to eliminate equipment variables." Alexandra nodded thoughtfully, as if considering the academic merits of the proposed methodology. "That seems reasonable. How many shots per distance?" 5-round groups, Hawthorne replied. "Standard precision shooting measurement. We'll calculate center-to-center grouping sizes and compare results." The parameters were being established with the precision of a scientific experiment, but everyone understood that the underlying dynamic was pure primal competition. Hawthorne was staking his reputation and authority on his ability to outshoot a civilian contractor in front of witnesses. Alexandra was risking exposure and humiliation for reasons that weren't entirely clear to the observers. Colonel Steele found herself making calculations that had nothing to do with ballistics or marksmanship. If she allowed this competition to proceed, she would be taking responsibility for whatever happened next. A civilian contractor's poor performance would reflect on her judgment in permitting the activity. Excellent performance would raise questions about why Pentagon contractors possessed advanced military skills. But refusing to allow the competition would validate claims that female officers were too risk-averse for combat leadership, that they prioritized avoiding problems over pursuing opportunities for education and training. Steele had spent her career walking this tightrope, trying to demonstrate competence without appearing too aggressive, showing authority without seeming confrontational. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Very well," she said finally, her decision surprising everyone, including herself. "We'll conduct this as an informal training exercise. Master Gunnery Sergeant Morrison will supervise range safety. We'll use standard precision rifles from the armory inventory. The exercise will be documented as marksmanship instruction for visiting personnel." Morrison's expression suggested he thought this was a mistake, but his years of experience had taught him when to voice objections and when to simply ensure that orders were carried out safely. "Aye, ma'am. I'll prep 2 identical M110 rifles and match-grade ammunition. Standard precision shooting protocols, witnessed scoring, documented results." The die was cast. What had begun as routine marksmanship training was transforming into something unprecedented, a direct competition between military expertise and civilian capability, between theoretical knowledge and practical experience, between established authority and unknown potential. As word spread through the base, personnel began arriving from all directions. Administrative staff found reasons to take breaks near the rifle range. Off-duty instructors emerged from their quarters. Even senior officers who rarely visited training areas began appearing, drawn by curiosity about an event that was already becoming base legend. Alexandra felt the familiar calm that preceded moments of truth. She'd spent weeks maintaining her cover, enduring condescension and underestimation while gathering intelligence about security vulnerabilities. Now she was about to reveal capabilities that could compromise her mission, while potentially advancing larger objectives about changing military culture. The morning sun climbed higher, creating thermals that would complicate long-range shooting. The desert wind began picking up, adding another variable to an already complex equation. And somewhere in the growing crowd of spectators, Those with genuine expertise began to sense that they were about to witness something extraordinary. The stage was set for a demonstration that would challenge assumptions, reveal hidden truths, and potentially change how everyone present thought about capability, prejudice, and the nature of warriorship itself. Word spread through Camp Ironclad with the speed of wildfire in dry grass. Within 30 minutes, what had begun as a routine training session had transformed into the most anticipated event in recent base history. Personnel emerged from buildings across the facility, drawn by a combination of curiosity, competitive excitement, and the rare opportunity to witness something genuinely unprecedented. Master Gunnery Sergeant Morrison worked with methodical precision to prepare the competition parameters, his experienced hands moving through familiar routines while his mind processed the implications of what was about to unfold. He selected 2 identical M110 semi-automatic sniper systems from the armory, weapons he'd personally zeroed and maintained to ensure consistent performance. Each rifle was equipped with a loopholed Mark IV scope, bipod, and cheek rest adjusted to neutral settings that would accommodate different shooting styles. The ammunition came from the same production lot, Federal Gold Medal Match 175 grain boat tail hollow points, the kind of precision rounds that eliminated variables and allowed true marksmanship ability to determine outcomes. Morrison inspected each cartridge individually, checking for consistent bullet seating, uniform case dimensions, and proper primer installation. In a competition where reputations were at stake, he wanted no equipment-related excuses for poor performance. The range itself had been cleared of other activities, with safety barriers established to create clear lanes of fire extending to the 1,000-meter targets. Morrison positioned spotters at each distance with high-power scopes to provide immediate feedback on shot placement. Electronic wind meters were deployed at 200-meter intervals to track changing atmospheric conditions that could affect bullet trajectory. Private Chen volunteered to serve as official scorer, a role that required him to measure group sizes with precision calipers and document results that would be scrutinized by dozens of witnesses. The young SEAL understood that his measurements would become part of base folklore, discussed and debated long after the actual competition ended. As the crowd grew larger, distinct factions began forming based on allegiances and expectations. Hawthorne's students and supporters clustered near the instructor's preparation area, their confidence in his abilities absolute. They'd seen him perform under pressure countless times, had witnessed his capabilities in training exercises that simulated combat stress, and knew that his reputation was built on genuine expertise rather than empty boasting. A smaller but growing group gathered around Colonel Steele, including several female personnel who rarely had opportunities to witness women competing directly against male counterparts in traditionally masculine domains. Their presence added another layer of complexity to the proceedings, transforming what might have been simple entertainment into something approaching a statement about gender roles and military capability. Morrison found himself managing not just the technical aspects of the competition, but also the psychological dynamics of an increasingly charged atmosphere. He'd seen similar situations deteriorate rapidly, when egos and politics overwhelmed professional judgment, and he was determined to maintain standards that would produce legitimate results, regardless of personal preferences. "Listen up," Morrison announced, his parade ground voice cutting through the crowd noise. "This is a training exercise, not a circus. We'll follow standard range safety protocols. Anyone who can't maintain appropriate discipline will be escorted off the range immediately." The announcement had its intended effect, reducing the carnival atmosphere while emphasizing that serious business was about to be conducted. Morrison had deliberately chosen language that framed the event as educational rather than competitive, providing official cover for what was essentially an unprecedented confrontation. Alexandra used the preparation time to conduct what appeared to be routine equipment checks, but was actually a series of subtle assessments that would inform her performance strategy. She examined the M110 rifle, with the practiced efficiency of someone intimately familiar with its characteristics, though she was careful to maintain the appearance of academic curiosity rather than operational expertise. The weapon was perfectly suited to her skills. She'd used identical rifles in combat situations across 3 different theaters, achieving confirmed kills at distances exceeding the ranges they would be shooting today. But her challenge wasn't technical proficiency. It was calibrating her performance to achieve specific objectives without revealing capabilities that would compromise her cover identity. She needed to perform well enough to challenge Hawthorne's assumptions about female capability, while avoiding displays of expertise that would raise questions about her background. The balance was delicate. Too poor a performance would validate his prejudices and potentially undermine broader objectives about military integration, while too strong a showing would expose her true identity and jeopardize an ongoing intelligence operation. Hawthorne prepared with the confidence of someone who'd never lost a shooting competition that mattered. He conducted his equipment checks with professional thoroughness, adjusting the rifle's stock to fit his frame and settling into shooting positions that had become second nature through thousands of hours of practice. His students watched his preparation with admiration, noting the economical movements and focused attention that characterized genuine expertise. But Hawthorne's confidence was based on assumptions that were about to be challenged in ways he couldn't anticipate. He'd categorized Dr. Rivers as a typical academic, intelligent but inexperienced in practical applications, knowledgeable about theory, but lacking the warrior mindset required for exceptional performance under pressure. His preparation focused on demonstrating superior technique rather than defending against capabilities he didn't believe existed. As the 600-meter targets were positioned and verified, Morrison established the shooting order through a simple coin toss. Hawthorne would shoot first, setting a standard that Dr. Rivers would attempt to match or exceed. The arrangement satisfied Hawthorne's preference for controlling the psychological dynamics. He would demonstrate his capabilities while placing pressure on his opponent to perform under scrutiny. The crowd arranged itself behind designated safety lines, with senior personnel claiming positions that provided optimal views of the shooting positions and target areas. Colonel Steele positioned herself where she could observe both competitors' techniques while maintaining the neutral stance required of her command position. Dr. Sarah Blackwood, the base's chief medical officer, arrived just as final preparations were being completed. She'd heard about the unprecedented competition through the medical staff's informal communication network and was curious to observe what promised to be a fascinating study in performance psychology and gender dynamics. Her presence added another layer of official oversight that would help legitimize whatever results emerged. The atmospheric conditions were challenging but not impossible. Desert thermals were creating heat shimmer that would complicate target identification, while a variable crosswind of 8 to 12 miles per hour would require constant adjustment for bullet drift. The combination of factors would test both competitors' ability to read environmental conditions and make real-time corrections based on observed bullet impacts. Morrison called the range to order with a sharp blast from his whistle, the sound cutting through conversation and focusing everyone's attention on the shooting line. First distance, 600 meters. 5 rounds for group measurement. Shooter will have unlimited time for preparation and execution. Scoring will be based on smallest group size measured center to center. Hawthorne approached the firing line with measured confidence, his movements deliberate and controlled. He settled into a prone position behind the rifle, adjusting his body alignment and establishing a natural point of aim that would allow him to fire multiple shots without fighting positional inconsistencies. His breathing settled into the controlled rhythm that experienced shooters use to minimize movement during trigger press. The first shot broke cleanly, the rifle's report echoing across the desert as a 175-grain bullet arced toward the distant target. Through the spotting scope, observers could see the impact a clean hit in the upper portion of the target's scoring area. Hawthorne worked his bolt smoothly, chambering the next round while maintaining his shooting position. 4 more shots followed in steady succession, each delivered with the mechanical precision that characterized truly skilled marksmen. Hawthorne's group was tight and well-centered, demonstrating the kind of consistency that separated expert shooters from weekend enthusiasts. The final measurement showed a group size of 2.7 inches at 600 meters, excellent performance that drew appreciative murmurs from the crowd. As Hawthorne cleared the firing line, his expression reflected quiet satisfaction. He'd performed to his expectations, establishing a standard that would be difficult for an inexperienced shooter to match. His students nodded approvingly, recognizing the quality of shooting they'd just witnessed. Alexandra approached the firing line with the measured pace of someone conducting a scientific experiment rather than engaging in competitive shooting. Her movements appeared academic and slightly uncertain, as if she were applying theoretical knowledge to an unfamiliar practical situation. She settled behind the rifle with what looked like textbook positioning that lacked the fluid confidence of extensive experience. What the observers couldn't see was the subtle shift in her mental state as she transitioned from the Dr. Rivers persona to something approaching her true capabilities. Years of training in psychological compartmentalization allowed her to access specific skill sets while maintaining overall character consistency. She was about to demonstrate marksmanship abilities that would challenge assumptions while carefully avoiding displays of expertise that would expose her true identity. The moment of truth had arrived, and everyone present sensed they were about to witness something that would be discussed and debated for years to come. The desert silence seemed to intensify as Alexandra settled into her shooting position, the weight of dozens of gazes creating an almost physical pressure. She adjusted the rifle stock with movements that appeared methodical but uncertain, as if she were applying classroom knowledge to an unfamiliar practical situation. Her breathing was controlled but audibly deliberate, the kind of conscious regulation that suggested nervousness rather than trained instinct. What none of the observers could detect was the subtle transformation occurring beneath her carefully maintained facade. Years of compartmentalized training allowed her to access specific skill sets while maintaining character consistency, a psychological technique developed by intelligence services to enable deep cover operatives to demonstrate capabilities without breaking their constructed identities. Through the rifle scope, the 600-meter target appeared crisp and clear despite the heat shimmer rising from the desert floor. Alexandra's enhanced vision, sharpened by years of training in multiple environments, automatically compensated for atmospheric distortion that would challenge lesser shooters. She could read wind patterns by observing dust movement, calculate temperature effects by feeling barrel expansion, and estimate range precisely through techniques that had been drilled into muscle memory. But she couldn't reveal those capabilities directly. Instead, she had to appear to struggle with calculations that she could perform instinctively, to hesitate over adjustments that were second nature, and to display uncertainty about conditions she could read like a familiar book. The performance required extraordinary discipline, suppressing years of training to appear authentically amateur, while still achieving results that would challenge preconceptions. Her first shot broke with a clean, crisp trigger press that surprised several observers. The rifle's recoil was absorbed smoothly, her follow-through textbook perfect. Through the spotting scope, Morrison watched the bullet impact appear slightly high and left of center, a placement that suggested good fundamentals compromised by nervousness or inexperience. Alexandra worked the bolt with careful deliberation, her movements appearing studied rather than instinctive. She made a visible scope adjustment, turning the elevation knob with the concentration of someone applying theoretical knowledge to practical problems. The gesture was authentic enough to convince observers that she was learning in real time rather than accessing pre-existing expertise. Her second shot impacted closer to center, prompting murmurs of approval from the crowd. The improvement suggested that Dr. Rivers possessed good basic skills that could be refined through practice, exactly the image Alexandra wanted to project. She was demonstrating competence without excellence, ability without expertise. Hawthorne watched her technique with growing confidence. Her shooting was respectable for a civilian, but it lacked the intuitive precision that characterized truly dangerous marksmen. Her groupings would likely be adequate for academic purposes but insufficient to challenge his superiority. His initial assessment appeared confirmed theoretical knowledge could produce acceptable results. but warrior instinct would always prevail when performance mattered. The third shot continued the pattern of steady improvement. Landing closer to the point of aim while maintaining safe distance from exceptional accuracy, Alexandra was walking a psychological tightrope, performing well enough to suggest potential while avoiding displays that would raise uncomfortable questions about her background. Private Chen recorded each shot's location with meticulous precision, aware that his measurements would become part of base legend regardless of the final outcome. The young SEAL found himself hoping that Dr. Rivers would perform respectably, not necessarily winning, but demonstrating that civilian expertise deserved consideration rather than dismissal. Colonel Steele watched the proceedings with growing tension. She understood the broader implications of what was unfolding. This wasn't just a marksmanship competition, but a test of assumptions about gender roles, military tradition, and the integration of civilian expertise into combat operations. Poor performance by Dr. Rivers would validate arguments about female limitations that Steele had been fighting throughout her career. As Alexandra prepared for her fourth shot, the wind conditions shifted subtly. Desert thermals were creating updrafts that would affect bullet trajectory. While the crosswind had increased to approximately 15 miles per hour, these changes would challenge any shooter's ability to maintain consistent accuracy. But they also provided Alexandra with an opportunity to demonstrate weather reading skills without appearing supernatural. She made another visible scope adjustment, this time for windage, her movements suggesting careful consideration of environmental factors. The gesture was calculated to appear academic, as if she were applying classroom knowledge about ballistics, rather than drawing on combat experience that had taught her to read atmospheric conditions instinctively. Her fourth shot landed near the center of the target, close enough to suggest genuine skill while maintaining enough imperfection to seem authentic. The crowd's murmurs grew more appreciative, recognizing that Dr. Rivers was performing better than anyone had anticipated while still trailing Hawthorne's demonstrated excellence. Master Gunnery Sergeant Morrison found himself reassessing his initial skepticism. Dr. Rivers was shooting with a consistency that suggested extensive training rather than beginner's luck. Her improvements between shots indicated someone who could process feedback and make corrections, a skill that required both technical knowledge and practical experience. His instincts, honed by 30 years of evaluating shooters, were detecting capabilities that didn't match her cover story. The fifth and final shot required careful calculation. Alexandra needed to produce a grouping that would be respectable without being suspicious, challenging Hawthorne's assumptions while avoiding performance levels that would compromise her mission. She made final adjustments to her scope and body position, movements that appeared tentative but were actually precisely calculated. The shot broke cleanly, the bullet arcing toward the distant target with ballistic precision that observers could appreciate even if they couldn't fully understand the technical factors involved. The impact appeared near the center of her developing group, creating a pattern that would measure respectably, while maintaining appropriate distance from Hawthorne's superior performance. As Alexandra cleared the firing line, her expression reflected mild satisfaction mixed with academic curiosity, the look of someone who'd applied theoretical knowledge with better results than expected. She removed her shooting glasses and ear protection with movements that suggested relief at completing an unfamiliar challenge rather than confidence in exceptional performance. Chen measured her group with careful precision, his calipers determining the exact center-to-center distance that would define her performance. The measurement was 3.4 inches at 600 meters, respectable shooting that demonstrated genuine skill while trailing Hawthorne's 2.7-inch group by a margin that validated his superior experience. The crowd's reaction was mixed but generally appreciative. Dr. Rivers had performed better than anyone anticipated, shooting with a competence that surprised those who'd expected civilian incompetence. But Hawthorne had maintained his superiority by a clear margin, demonstrating that warrior experience produced results that academic knowledge couldn't match. Hawthorne's expression reflected satisfaction with the outcome. Dr. Rivers had shot respectably for a civilian, confirming that intelligence and training could produce adequate results. But his superior performance validated his core arguments about the difference between theoretical knowledge and warrior capability. He'd proven his point without completely humiliating his opponent, exactly the outcome he'd 24 backs hoped to achieve. What none of the observers understood was that Alexandra had achieved her own objectives with equal precision. She'd demonstrated capabilities that would challenge assumptions about female potential, while avoiding displays of expertise that would compromise her cover identity. The performance was calibrated to advance long-term goals about changing military culture while protecting the immediate requirements of an ongoing intelligence operation. As preparations began for the 800-meter phase of the competition, the crowd's energy shifted from curiosity to genuine anticipation. The first distance had established that both competitors possessed legitimate skills. Now they would test those abilities under increasingly challenging conditions. The longer range would amplify small errors in technique while demanding greater precision in reading environmental factors. Morrison announced a brief break to allow both shooters to prepare for the next phase, while range personnel verified target placement and wind measurement equipment. The pause gave observers time to discuss what they'd witnessed and speculate about what might happen as conditions became more demanding. Alexandra used the interval to continue her subtle intelligence gathering, noting conversations that revealed attitudes about female capability, civilian expertise, and military tradition. Every comment, every expression, every gesture was being cataloged for later analysis about institutional biases that could compromise operational security. The morning was building toward revelations that would challenge everyone present, forcing them to confront assumptions about capability, prejudice, and the true nature of expertise in an increasingly complex world. The 800-meter distance transformed the competition from a test of basic marksmanship into something approaching the demands of operational shooting. At this range, minor errors in technique became magnified failures, while environmental factors that could be ignored at shorter distances became critical variables that separated competent shooters from true marksmen. Morrison repositioned the spotting scopes and wind measurement equipment, his practiced eye noting the subtle changes in atmospheric conditions that would complicate the next phase. Desert thermals were intensifying as the morning sun climbed higher, creating heat shimmer that would make target identification increasingly difficult. The crosswind had shifted to a quartering angle, adding complexity that would test both competitors' ability to calculate bullet drift in 3 dimensions. The crowd had swelled to nearly 200 personnel, drawn by word-of-mouth reports that described Dr. Rivers' unexpected competence at 600 meters. Senior officers who rarely observed training exercises found reasons to visit the range, their presence adding layers of institutional scrutiny that would influence how the results were interpreted and remembered. Among the newcomers was Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Webb, the base's deputy commander for training operations. Webb had built his reputation on developing innovative marksmanship programs that integrated civilian academic research with military practical experience. His presence suggested that the morning's events had attracted attention at levels where policy decisions were made and careers were shaped. Also arriving was Dr. Elizabeth Carter, a Pentagon consultant specializing in military personnel integration issues. Carter had been conducting research on gender bias in military training environments, and reports of a female civilian challenging a male instructor had triggered her professional curiosity. Her notebook was already filled with observations about crowd dynamics and institutional reactions that would inform future policy recommendations. Hawthorne prepared for the 800-meter phase with the methodical confidence of someone who'd shot at this distance thousands of times under conditions ranging from ideal to impossible. His scope adjustments were minimal. He knew his rifle's trajectory characteristics precisely and trusted his ability to read wind patterns that others found confusing. The increased range played to his strengths, demanding exactly the kind of intuitive understanding that separated warriors from academics. His students watched his preparation with appreciation for technical details that escaped casual observers. Hawthorne's position behind the rifle was a masterclass in precision shooting fundamentals: body alignment that created a stable platform, breathing control that minimized movement during trigger press, and a shooting cadence that allowed maximum accuracy without rushing critical decisions. "Range is now clear for 800 meters," Morrison announced, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd supervised thousands of similar exercises. "Same protocols as before: 5 rounds for group measurement, unlimited time for preparation, and execution." Hawthorne approached the firing line with the easy confidence of someone operating well within his capabilities. The 800-meter targets looked smaller but remained clearly visible through his scope, their scoring rings distinct enough for precise aiming. He settled into position with economical movements, establishing his natural point of aim while calculating environmental factors that would influence bullet trajectory. His first shot broke with mechanical precision, the rifle's recoil managed through technique that had become instinctive through years of practice. The bullet impact appeared slightly right of center, a placement that reflected the quartering wind's influence on the projectile's flight path. Hawthorne made a minute windage adjustment, trusting his ability to read atmospheric conditions that others found mystifying. The subsequent 4 shots followed in steady succession, each delivered with the controlled precision that characterized truly expert marksmanship. Hawthorne's grouping was tight and well-centered despite challenging conditions, demonstrating mastery of technical skills that few shooters ever achieved. The final measurement showed 3.2 inches at 800 meters, exceptional performance that drew respectful silence from knowledgeable observers. As Hawthorne cleared the firing line, his expression reflected quiet satisfaction with results that validated his reputation while establishing a standard that would be extremely difficult for an inexperienced shooter to approach. His students nodded with appreciation, recognizing shooting that represented the pinnacle of precision marksmanship under field conditions. Alexandra approached her turn with apparent trepidation, her movements suggesting someone facing challenges that exceeded her comfort zone. The increased distance had transformed targets from clearly visible circles into small dots that required careful sight alignment and precise trigger control. She adjusted her scope with the deliberate movements of someone applying theoretical calculations to practical problems. But beneath her academic facade, Alexandra was accessing capabilities that had been developed through training programs that pushed human performance beyond conventional limitations. Her enhanced vision automatically compensated for atmospheric distortion, while her muscle memory guided scope adjustments that appeared conscious but were actually instinctive responses developed through thousands of hours of practice. The critical challenge was calibrating her performance to achieve specific psychological objectives without revealing expertise that would compromise her cover. She needed to demonstrate improvement that would suggest potential while maintaining enough imperfection to appear authentically civilian. The balance was becoming increasingly delicate as distances increased and margins for error diminished. Her scope adjustments appeared more confident than at 600 meters, suggesting someone who was learning from experience and gaining comfort with unfamiliar equipment. The gesture was calculated to show growth, without revealing pre-existing knowledge, exactly the kind of improvement curve that would be expected from an intelligent civilian, applying academic principles to practical challenges. The first shot required careful calculation of multiple variables. Alexandra needed to account for wind drift, temperature effects, and atmospheric pressure, while appearing to struggle with calculations that were actually second nature. Her technique had to suggest someone applying classroom knowledge rather than accessing combat-tested expertise. The shot broke cleanly after what appeared to be careful deliberation. The bullet impact landed closer to center than her initial 600-meter shots, suggesting improvement through experience while maintaining enough imperfection to seem authentic. The crowd's murmurs reflected appreciation for progress that exceeded expectations while remaining within believable parameters. Morrison watched her technique through high-power optics, his experienced eye detecting subtle elements that didn't match her cover story. Her shooting position was more stable than most civilians achieved without extensive training. Her breathing control followed military protocols rather than civilian sport shooting techniques. Most tellingly, her recovery from recoil was too smooth and controlled for someone with limited rifle experience. Alexandra's subsequent shots continued the pattern of steady improvement, each impact building a grouping that suggested genuine skill development while avoiding displays of exceptional capability. She was performing a delicate balancing act, demonstrating enough competence to challenge assumptions while maintaining sufficient imperfection to preserve her cover identity. Colonel Steele watched the proceedings with growing tension, understanding that the competition had evolved beyond simple marksmanship into something approaching a test of institutional attitudes about capability and potential. Dr. Rivers was performing well enough to suggest that civilian expertise deserved serious consideration, challenging assumptions that could influence policy decisions about military-civilian integration. The crowd's energy had shifted from casual entertainment to intense scrutiny as observers recognized they were witnessing something significant. Conversations buzzed with speculation about Dr. Rivers' background, her training, and the implications of her unexpected competence. The morning's events were generating discussions that would continue long after the competition ended. As Alexandra prepared for her final shot at 800 meters, she calculated not just ballistic factors but psychological objectives that would determine how her performance was interpreted and remembered. She needed to produce results that would advance long-term goals about changing military culture, while protecting immediate requirements of her ongoing mission. The shot broke with clean precision, completing a grouping that would measure respectably while maintaining appropriate distance from Hawthorne's superior performance. Her group measured 4.1 inches, shooting that demonstrated genuine improvement and challenged expectations, while avoiding displays of expertise that would raise uncomfortable questions about her true capabilities. The competition was building toward its climactic phase at 1,000 meters, where atmospheric conditions and technical demands would test both competitors at the limits of their abilities. The longest distance would reveal truths that shorter ranges had only hinted at, forcing everyone present to confront assumptions about capability, training, and the nature of expertise in an increasingly complex military environment. The transition to 1,000 meters marked the moment when the competition shifted from challenging marksmanship to the realm where only exceptional shooters could achieve meaningful results. At this distance, the targets appeared as mere dots through even high-powered scopes, while environmental factors that were manageable at shorter ranges became dominating variables that could scatter bullets across wide areas regardless of shooter skill. Master Gunnery Sergeant Morrison repositioned his spotting equipment with the gravity of someone who understood that what happened next would define how this day was remembered. The 1,000-meter targets seemed to float in the heat shimmer like mirages, their scoring rings barely visible even through precision optics. Wind conditions had become increasingly complex, with thermals creating vertical currents that would challenge even the most sophisticated ballistic calculations. The crowd had grown silent with anticipation, recognizing that they were approaching the climactic moment of an event that had already exceeded everyone's expectations. Senior officers clustered in small groups, their conversations hushed as they processed the implications of what they'd witnessed. Dr. Rivers had performed far better than anyone had anticipated, shooting with a competence that challenged fundamental assumptions about civilian capabilities. Lieutenant Colonel Webb found himself reassessing preconceptions that had guided his entire approach to training program development. His integration of civilian academic research with military practical experience had been based on the assumption that academics could contribute theoretical knowledge while lacking the intuitive skills that defined warrior excellence. Dr. Rivers's performance suggested that the relationship between theory and practice might be more complex than he'd understood. Dr. Carter continued filling her notebook with observations about institutional dynamics that revealed deep-seated biases about gender and capability. The crowd's reactions reflected a cognitive struggle people were witnessing performance that contradicted their expectations while searching for explanations that would preserve existing belief systems. The psychological tension was palpable as observers tried to reconcile evidence with preconceptions. Hawthorne prepared for the 1,000-meter phase, with the focused intensity of someone whose reputation was being challenged in ways he hadn't anticipated. Dr. Rivers' respectable performance at shorter distances had exceeded his expectations, but the longest range would separate genuine expertise from lucky accuracy. At 1,000 meters, minor errors became catastrophic failures, while environmental factors demanded the kind of intuitive understanding that only came through extensive combat experience. His scope adjustments were more complex now, accounting for bullet drop that would carry his projectiles nearly 40 feet below the line of sight. Wind calculations required three-dimensional thinking about how crosscurrents, thermals, and atmospheric pressure would influence bullet flight over the extended trajectory. These were the conditions where warrior instinct truly mattered, where book knowledge fell short and practical experience determined outcomes. Final distance, 1,000 meters, Morrison announced, his voice cutting through the desert silence with military precision. Standard protocols remain in effect. 5 rounds for group measurement. Unlimited time for preparation and execution. Hawthorne approached the firing line with movements that reflected supreme confidence in his abilities. The 1,000-meter targets were barely visible as small circles against the desert backdrop, their scoring rings invisible without magnification. He settled into his shooting position with the economy of motion that characterized truly expert marksmen, establishing sight alignment and natural point of aim through muscle memory developed over thousands of similar shots. His first round required careful calculation of multiple variables that would influence bullet flight over the extended range, atmospheric pressure, temperature gradients, wind direction and velocity at different altitudes. Even the rotation of the Earth itself became factors in determining precise point of aim. Hawthorne made these calculations instinctively, his experience providing shortcuts that others would need computers to replicate. The shot broke with mechanical precision, sending a 175-grain bullet on a trajectory that would carry it nearly 3/4 of a mile to the distant target. Through the spotting scope, observers watched the impact appear in the lower portion of the scoring area, a clean hit that accounted for the massive bullet drop characteristic of extreme range shooting. Working with practiced efficiency, Hawthorne delivered 4 additional shots that demonstrated mastery of long-range precision techniques. Each round landed within a tight pattern that reflected exceptional skill under challenging conditions. His final group measured 4.8 inches at 1,000 meters, shooting that represented the pinnacle of military marksmanship capability. As Hawthorne cleared the firing line, his expression reflected quiet satisfaction with performance that validated his expertise while establishing a standard that would be virtually impossible for an inexperienced shooter to approach. The crowd's reaction was subdued appreciation for technical excellence that few observers fully understood, but all could recognize as exceptional. Alexandra approached her turn with apparent concentration, her movements suggesting someone facing the ultimate test of theoretical knowledge against practical application. The 1,000-meter distance represented the absolute limit of what civilian sport shooting typically attempted, requiring skills that were rarely developed outside military or law enforcement training programs. But beneath her academic facade, Alexandra was accessing capabilities that had been developed through training programs that pushed human performance beyond conventional boundaries. Her scope adjustments appeared deliberate and calculated, suggesting someone applying classroom knowledge to extreme practical challenges. In reality, she was fine-tuning equipment settings that she knew intuitively, drawing on experience gained through missions where successful shots at similar distances had meant the difference between mission success and American casualties. The critical challenge had become almost impossible to manage. She needed to demonstrate shooting that would challenge preconceptions about female capability while avoiding displays of expertise that would expose her true identity. At 1,000 meters, the margin between believable civilian competence and obvious military training was measured in fractions of inches. Her first shot required the most delicate calculation yet. Alexandra needed to account for ballistic factors that would influence bullet flight while appearing to struggle with calculations that were actually instinctive. Her technique had to suggest someone applying academic knowledge to practical challenges rather than accessing combat-proven expertise. The shot broke after what appeared to be careful deliberation. The bullet impact landed within the scoring area, demonstrating that Dr. Rivers possessed the fundamental skills necessary for extreme-range shooting while maintaining enough imperfection to seem authentically civilian. The crowd's reaction reflected amazement that a ballistics researcher could achieve meaningful accuracy at such distances. Morrison found himself completely reassessing his evaluation of Dr. Rivers' background and capabilities. Her shooting at 1,000 meters was demonstrating skills that typically required years of specialized training to develop. The consistency of her performance suggested muscle memory and instinctive understanding that contradicted her cover story of limited practical experience. Colonel Steele watched the proceedings with growing tension as she recognized that the competition had evolved into something with implications far beyond simple marksmanship. Dr. Rivers was performing at levels that challenged fundamental assumptions about civilian capabilities, potentially providing ammunition for arguments about expanding women's roles in combat operations. Alexandra's subsequent shots continued building a grouping that walked the razor's edge between competence and expertise. Each impact demonstrated genuine skill, while maintaining enough variation to appear consistent with civilian training levels. She was performing the most delicate balancing act of her career, revealing capabilities that would advance long-term objectives while protecting the immediate requirements of her classified mission. As she prepared for her fifth and final shot, Alexandra calculated not just ballistic factors but the psychological impact of her overall performance. She needed to produce results that would challenge Hawthorne's assumptions while avoiding displays of skill that would compromise her cover identity or trigger security investigations that could expose classified operations. The shot broke with clean precision, completing a grouping that measured 6.2 inches at 1,000 meters. Shooting that was remarkable for a civilian, while trailing Hawthorne's group by a margin that preserved his superior reputation. The measurement represented exactly the performance Alexandra had calculated to achieve maximum psychological impact while maintaining operational security. The crowd's reaction was stunned silence as observers processed the implications of what they'd witnessed. Dr. Rivers had shot with competence that challenged every assumption about civilian capabilities, demonstrating skills that suggested extensive training despite her academic background. The morning's events had shattered preconceptions and forced everyone present to reconsider beliefs about capability, training, and the nature of expertise. But the competition wasn't over. The most dramatic revelation was yet to come. The silence that followed Alexandra's final shot was unlike anything Master Gunnery Sergeant Morrison had experienced in 30 years of supervising military training exercises. 200 personnel stood motionless in the desert heat, processing the implications of what they'd witnessed with expressions that ranged from amazement to confusion to something approaching cognitive dissonance. Dr. Samantha Rivers, a mild-mannered ballistics researcher with wire-rimmed glasses and a PhD in applied physics, had just demonstrated marksmanship capabilities that challenged fundamental assumptions about civilian training, female potential, and the relationship between theoretical knowledge and practical expertise. Her 6.2-inch group at 1,000 meters represented shooting that most military personnel would consider exceptional, particularly under the challenging environmental conditions that had dominated the morning. Hawthorne stood beside his superior 4.8-inch grouping with an expression that reflected profound confusion rather than the triumph he'd anticipated. He'd won the competition by clear margins at every distance, validating his superior experience and training exactly as he'd expected. But Dr. Rivers' performance had been far closer to his own capabilities than any civilian should have achieved, forcing him to confront the possibility that his fundamental understanding of expertise and capability might be flawed. Colonel Steele found herself facing a moment of decision that would define not just how this morning was remembered, but how similar situations would be handled throughout her command. The competition had produced results that challenged institutional assumptions while remaining technically within acceptable parameters. Dr. Rivers had performed admirably without actually winning, providing evidence for multiple interpretations depending on one's perspective and prejudices. But Morrison's instincts were screaming that something crucial was still hidden beneath the surface. His 3 decades of experience had taught him to recognize when situations contained elements that hadn't been fully revealed, and every indicator suggested that Dr. Rivers possessed capabilities that exceeded even her remarkable demonstration. Outstanding shooting by both competitors, Morrison announced, his official voice masking personal concerns about what he'd observed. Results will be documented and made available for training analysis purposes. It was a careful statement that acknowledged exceptional performance while maintaining professional neutrality about its implications. But Morrison's words couldn't diffuse the psychological tension that had been building throughout the morning as observers struggled to reconcile evidence with preconceptions. Private Chen stepped forward to congratulate both shooters, his young face reflecting admiration for skills that represented everything he aspired to achieve through his military career. "Ma'am, that was incredible shooting. How did you learn to read wind conditions like that?" It was an innocent question from someone genuinely curious about technical details, but it highlighted the central mystery that had emerged from the morning's events. Dr. Rivers had demonstrated weather reading skills that typically required extensive training to develop, raising questions about her background that her academic credentials didn't address. Alexandra responded with the measured tone that characterized her Dr. Rivers persona. But internally she was calculating the risks and opportunities created by the morning's revelations. She'd achieved her primary objective of challenging assumptions about female capability, while maintaining enough distance from victory to preserve her cover identity. But the level of scrutiny her performance had generated was approaching dangerous territory. "Years of studying atmospheric physics," she replied carefully. "Ballistic trajectories are heavily influenced by environmental factors that can be calculated if you understand the underlying principles." It was a plausible explanation that reinforced her academic background while deflecting attention from practical experience that would be harder to explain. But Morrison's experienced eye detected subtle elements in her response that suggested more complex truth beneath surface explanations. Dr. Carter had filled multiple notebook pages with observations about institutional dynamics that were revealing deep-seated biases about capability and potential. The crowd's reactions reflected a psychological struggle between evidence and expectation that would influence how these events were interpreted and remembered. Her research on gender bias in military environments had rarely provided such clear examples of cognitive dissonance in action. Lieutenant Colonel Webb found himself reconsidering fundamental assumptions about training program development that had guided his entire career. The integration of civilian academic knowledge with military practical experience might require more sophisticated approaches than he'd previously understood. Dr. Rivers' performance suggested that the relationship between theory and practice was more complex than conventional wisdom acknowledged. As personnel began dispersing from the range, conversations buzzed with speculation about what they'd witnessed and what it meant for broader questions about military training and capability assessment. The morning's events would be discussed and debated for months, potentially influencing policy decisions about personnel integration and training methodologies. But Hawthorne wasn't ready to accept that the demonstration was over. His competitive instincts and professional pride were struggling with results that challenged his worldview while technically validating his superior experience. He'd proven his point about warrior excellence. But Dr. Rivers' unexpected competence was forcing him to question assumptions that had guided his entire career. "Dr. Rivers," Hawthorne called out, his voice carrying across the range with the authority of someone who wasn't finished making his case. "That was impressive shooting for someone with limited practical experience. But marksmanship competition is different from combat application. Would you be interested in a more challenging demonstration? The words hung in the desert air like a gauntlet thrown down at a medieval tournament. Morrison felt his stomach tighten as he recognized that Hawthorne was escalating beyond the careful parameters they'd established for the morning's activities. Whatever he was proposing would push the situation into territory where careers could be damaged and reputations destroyed. Alexandra turned to face Hawthorne with an expression of polite curiosity that masked rapid calculations about risks and opportunities. She could decline gracefully, preserving her cover while ending the confrontation on terms that would satisfy most observers. Her mission objectives had been largely achieved through the standard competition format, but Hawthorne's tone contained elements of challenge and dismissal that suggested he wasn't ready to acknowledge the implications of her performance. His worldview required explanations that would preserve existing hierarchies, while explaining away evidence that contradicted his fundamental beliefs about capability and expertise. "What kind of demonstration did you have in mind, Sergeant?" Alexandra asked, her academic tone suggesting intellectual curiosity rather than competitive interest. Hawthorne's predatory smile returned as he sensed another opportunity to establish definitive superiority while exposing the limitations of civilian training under pressure. "Moving targets," he said, his voice carrying the confidence of someone who'd never lost a shooting competition that truly mattered. Combat shooting isn't about precision groups on static paper. It's about hitting targets that don't want to be hit, under conditions that change faster than you can calculate. The crowd's energy shifted immediately, as observers recognized that the morning's events were building towards something unprecedented. Moving target shooting required capabilities that separated sport marksmen from combat operators, demanding instinctive reactions and split-second decision-making that civilian training rarely developed. Morrison stepped forward, his authority as range safety officer giving him the power to shut down activities that exceeded safe parameters. "Sergeant Hawthorne, moving target protocols require specific safety certifications and equipment configurations that we don't have authorized for today's activities." It was a diplomatic way of saying that what Hawthorne was proposing could violate multiple regulations while creating liability issues that would follow everyone involved through their careers. The range's moving target systems were sophisticated equipment designed for specific training programs with carefully controlled safety protocols. But Colonel Steele found herself facing the same dilemma that had shaped her entire career, choosing between safe decisions that avoided controversy and bold actions that could advance larger objectives about changing military culture. The morning's events had already challenged institutional assumptions in ways that could influence policy decisions about gender integration and capability assessment. "What specific parameters are you proposing?" Steele asked, her question surprising everyone, including herself. Alexandra felt the familiar calm that preceded moments when her true nature would be revealed, when years of training and sacrifice would be tested under conditions that would define how she was remembered. The moving target challenge represented exactly the kind of demonstration that could shatter preconceptions while exposing capabilities that would compromise her mission. But it also offered an opportunity to advance objectives that transcended her individual assignment, the chance to challenge systemic biases that were compromising military effectiveness while demonstrating possibilities that could influence future policy decisions about personnel utilization and training methodologies. The moment of truth was approaching faster than anyone had anticipated. Hawthorne's challenge had transformed the competition from a controlled marksmanship demonstration into something approaching combat simulation. Moving targets required capabilities that separated sport shooters from operational marksmen, the ability to track dynamic objectives while calculating lead angles, target speed, and environmental factors in real time under pressure that would overwhelm lesser shooters. 18 clay pigeons launched from multiple angles, Hawthorne announced, his confidence building as he outlined parameters that would expose the limitations of civilian training. Standard trap machines positioned at varying distances. Targets will be released in random sequences to eliminate predictability. Shooters will have 30 seconds to engage all objectives using standard tactical rifles. The proposed demonstration went far beyond anything that had been attempted at Camp Ironclad during routine training operations. Clay pigeon shooting typically involved shotguns and relatively close ranges, while tactical rifle engagement of aerial targets required skills that few marksmen ever developed. The combination of time pressure, multiple moving objectives, and precision rifle requirements would challenge even experienced operators. Morrison's expression reflected growing alarm as he calculated the safety and liability implications of what was being proposed. Moving target shooting with high-powered rifles required specific range configurations, impact area controls, and safety protocols that hadn't been established for the morning's activities. The legal ramifications alone could end multiple careers if anything went wrong. "Sergeant Hawthorne," Morrison said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd supervised thousands of training exercises without safety incidents. "What you're proposing exceeds the parameters we've established for today's demonstration. Clay target shooting with precision rifles requires specialized safety protocols and impact area clearance that, belay that," Colonel Steele interrupted, her decision surprising everyone, including herself. She'd spent her career calculating risks and choosing safe options that avoided controversy. But the morning's events had forced her to confront the cost of that cautious approach. "Range is clear for 5 miles in all directions. We have qualified safety personnel and appropriate medical support. If both shooters consent to the parameters, we'll proceed." The crowd's energy shifted immediately as observers recognized that they were about to witness something unprecedented in military training history. The combination of precision rifles and aerial moving targets represented a shooting discipline that few marksmen ever attempted, requiring capabilities that bordered on supernatural under combat stress conditions. Dr. Carter's notebook filled rapidly as she documented the psychological dynamics of an event that was revealing institutional attitudes about capability, gender, and the limits of human performance. The crowd's reactions reflected deep-seated assumptions about what was possible for different categories of personnel, beliefs that were about to be tested in the most dramatic way imaginable. Alexandra felt the familiar transformation that occurred when her true capabilities were about to be revealed. For weeks, she'd maintained the Dr. Rivers persona, while enduring condescension and underestimation that challenged every instinct developed through years of elite training. Now she was approaching the moment when maintaining her cover would become impossible, when the choice between mission security and larger objectives would force her to make decisions with consequences that extended far beyond her individual assignment. "I'm not sure I understand the specific requirements," Alexandra said, maintaining her academic tone while internally calculating the implications of what Hawthorne was proposing. Clay pigeon shooting typically involves shotguns rather than precision rifles. The ballistic characteristics are completely different. Hawthorne's predatory smile widened as he sensed another opportunity to demonstrate superior understanding while exposing civilian limitations. "Exactly the point, Dr. Rivers. Combat shooting isn't about controlled conditions and static targets. It's about adapting to dynamic situations that don't match textbook scenarios. Aerial targets simulate the kind of snap shooting that separates operators from academics." Private Chen volunteered to operate the Clay launching systems, his enthusiasm reflecting genuine curiosity about capabilities that represented everything he aspired to achieve through military training. The young SEAL had never witnessed precision rifle shooting at aerial targets, understanding that such demonstrations required skills that few marksmen possessed. The trap machines were positioned at varying distances and angles to create crossing flight paths that would challenge any shooter's ability to calculate lead angles and target interception points. Clay pigeons launched at 60 miles per hour would require split-second reactions and instinctive shooting skills that civilian training rarely developed. Morrison supervised the safety preparations with the meticulous attention to detail that had prevented accidents throughout his career. Impact areas were verified and cleared. Spotters were positioned to track target fragments, and medical personnel were briefed on potential scenarios that could require emergency response. His experience told him that what was about to happen would either be spectacular success or catastrophic failure with little middle ground. Hawthorne prepared for his demonstration with the focused intensity of someone whose reputation and worldview were being challenged in ways he hadn't anticipated. Aerial target shooting with precision rifles was among the most difficult disciplines in military marksmanship, requiring capabilities that he'd developed through thousands of hours of practice under conditions that simulated combat stress. His rifle was configured for rapid target acquisition rather than precision accuracy. Scout scope with low magnification, lightweight barrel for quick handling, and modified trigger group that facilitated rapid fire without sacrificing control. These were the specifications that combat experience had taught him were necessary for engaging multiple targets under time pressure. "Ready, on the firing line," Morrison announced, his voice reflecting professional composure that masked personal concerns about what he was about to supervise. 18 targets will be launched in random sequence over 30 seconds. Engage all targets as quickly as possible while maintaining safe muzzle discipline. Hawthorne settled into a standing shooting position that provided maximum mobility for tracking multiple targets across wide engagement areas. His breathing was controlled but alert, ready to transition from relaxed awareness to combat intensity when the first clay appeared. This was his element: dynamic shooting under pressure that separated warriors from pretenders. The first clay launched with a sharp mechanical snap, arcing across the desert sky at an angle that required immediate calculation of lead distance and target interception point. Hawthorne's rifle came up smoothly, tracking the orange disc through his scope while calculating the precise moment when trigger press would send his bullet to the target's future position. His shot broke cleanly, the clay exploding in a cloud of orange fragments that drew appreciative murmurs from the crowd. He worked his bolt smoothly while scanning for the next target, his movements economical and precise. The second clay appeared from a different angle, requiring rapid adjustment of stance and aim point. For the next 28 seconds, Hawthorne delivered a masterclass in dynamic precision shooting. His rifle tracked targets with mechanical efficiency while his bolt worked in rhythm with his breathing and target acquisition. Clay after clay exploded under precise fire that demonstrated capabilities few marksmen ever developed. When the exercise concluded, Hawthorne had successfully engaged 16 of 18 targets, performance that represented exceptional skill under conditions that would challenge any shooter. The 2 misses resulted from simultaneous launches that created target conflicts requiring split-second prioritization decisions. The crowd's reaction was subdued appreciation for technical excellence that most observers couldn't fully comprehend but all could recognize as extraordinary. Hawthorne's demonstration had validated his claims about warrior capabilities while establishing a standard that would be virtually impossible for civilian training to match. As Hawthorne cleared the firing line, his expression reflected quiet confidence in results that would definitively prove his arguments about the superiority of combat experience over academic knowledge. No civilian, regardless of theoretical understanding, could match performance that required years of specialized training to develop. Alexandra approached the firing line with movements that appeared hesitant and uncertain, suggesting someone facing challenges that exceeded her capabilities and experience. The academic facade she'd maintained throughout the morning would be impossible to preserve through what was about to happen, forcing her to choose between mission security and larger objectives that transcended her individual assignment. But as she settled into her shooting position, something fundamental shifted in her presence and demeanor. The transformation was subtle, but unmistakable to those trained to recognize such changes. The way her stance widened slightly, how her breathing deepened and controlled, the manner in which her eyes began tracking potential target areas with predatory focus. Master Gunnery Sergeant Morrison felt his pulse quicken as recognition dawned about what he was about to witness. Dr. Samantha Rivers was about to disappear, and someone else entirely was preparing to demonstrate capabilities that would redefine everyone's understanding of what was possible. The moment of truth had finally arrived. The transformation was instantaneous and complete. As Alexandra settled behind the rifle, every trace of Dr. Samantha Rivers' hesitant academic demeanor vanished, replaced by something that made Master Gunnery Sergeant Morrison's blood run cold with recognition. Her stance shifted from uncertain civilian posture to the controlled readiness of someone who'd killed with precision under conditions that would break lesser operators. Her breathing deepened into the combat rhythm that characterized truly dangerous marksman-controlled inhalation that maximized oxygen while minimizing movement during critical moments. Her eyes, which had appeared mild and scholarly behind wire-rimmed glasses, now tracked potential target zones with the predatory focus of an apex predator scanning for prey. The crowd sensed the shift without understanding its implications. Conversations died as observers recognized that something fundamental had changed in the woman behind the rifle. Colonel Steele felt her pulse quicken as she processed body language that contradicted everything she thought she knew about their civilian contractor. Morrison's hand moved instinctively toward his radio, warrior instinct screaming that he was witnessing the emergence of something that exceeded all previous parameters. 30 years of experience had taught him to recognize genuine operators, and every indicator suggested that Dr. Rivers possessed capabilities that her cover story couldn't begin to explain. "Ready on the firing line," Morrison announced, his voice steady despite internal alarm bells that were demanding immediate action. 18 targets, 30 seconds, engage when ready. Alexandra's response was a barely perceptible nod that communicated absolute readiness without wasted movement. Her rifle was positioned for maximum mobility, scope settings optimized for rapid target acquisition across wide engagement zones. But more telling was her stance-weight balance for immediate movement in any direction. Feet positioned to absorb recoil while maintaining target tracking capability. The first clay launched with mechanical precision, arcing across the desert sky, at an angle that would challenge any marksman's ability to calculate interception points under time pressure. Alexandra's rifle moved with fluid grace that defied the laws of physics as commonly understood, tracking the orange disc with supernatural smoothness, while her trigger finger prepared for the precise moment when bullet and target would occupy the same space. Her shot broke with crisp authority. The clay exploded in a shower of orange fragments exactly as predicted, but Alexandra was already transitioning to scan for the next target before the debris had begun falling. Her bolt worked with mechanical efficiency, chambering the next round while her eyes searched engagement areas for movement. The second clay appeared from a different trajectory, launched simultaneously with a third target, that created the kind of multiple threat scenario that separated competent shooters from truly exceptional operators. Alexandra's rifle tracked both targets with impossible precision, her mind calculating interception points for moving objects while factoring wind drift, target speed, and bullet flight time. 2 shots in rapid succession. 2 clays exploded almost simultaneously, fragments raining down while Alexandra's bolt worked in rhythm with breathing that remained perfectly controlled despite the physical demands of dynamic shooting. Her movements were economical and precise, every motion serving multiple purposes while preparing for the next engagement. The crowd watched in stunned silence, as target after target exploded under fire that seemed to defy the limitations of human reaction time and precision. Alexandra moved behind the rifle like a dancer performing a choreographed routine, each shot flowing seamlessly into preparation for the next while maintaining accuracy that belonged in legend rather than reality. Clay pigeons launched from multiple angles created crossing flight paths that would confuse most shooters, but Alexandra tracked each target with predatory focus while calculating interception points that accounted for variables most marksmen never considered. Her shooting was mathematical in its precision while appearing effortlessly intuitive. Private Chen operated the launching systems with growing amazement as he watched targets disappear under fire that seemed almost supernatural in its accuracy. His young SEAL training had exposed him to exceptional marksmen, but nothing had prepared him for witnessing capabilities that redefined his understanding of what human beings could achieve with rifles. Hawthorne stood frozen beside his excellent, but clearly inferior performance, his worldview crumbling as he processed evidence that challenged every assumption about capability, training, and the nature of expertise. 16 hits out of 18 targets had represented exceptional performance that validated years of combat experience. What he was witnessing now belonged in a different category entirely. Target after target exploded with mechanical precision, as Alexandra demonstrated capabilities that few people on Earth possessed. Her shooting transcended traditional marksmanship to become something approaching combat artistry, each shot perfectly calculated while appearing effortlessly instinctive, each movement economical, while serving multiple tactical purposes. As the final seconds counted down, Alexandra engaged the last remaining targets with movements that seemed to slow time itself. Her rifle tracked clays through complex flight paths, while her bolt worked with supernatural efficiency, each shot breaking exactly when ballistic calculations demanded while preparing immediately for the next engagement. When the 30-second time limit expired, 18 orange clouds of clay fragments were settling to the desert floor. Alexandra had achieved perfect performance under conditions that would challenge the finest marksman in the world, demonstrating capabilities that existed at the absolute pinnacle of human potential. The silence that followed was profound and complete. 200 military personnel stood motionless in the desert heat, processing implications that challenged fundamental assumptions about capability, training, and the nature of elite performance. They had witnessed something that would be discussed and debated for decades, a demonstration of marksmanship that belonged in military legend. Alexandra slowly lowered her rifle, her breathing returning to normal rhythms while her eyes scanned the crowd with the same predatory awareness that had characterized her shooting. The transformation back to civilian demeanor was deliberate and controlled, but the mask could never be completely restored. Too much had been revealed for Dr. Rivers to exist unchanged. Morrison stepped forward, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd finally understood what he'd been observing all morning. "Ma'am, I think it's time we discussed exactly who you are and why you're really here." Question hung in the desert air, like a challenge that would define everything that happened next. Alexandra felt the weight of multiple gazes focused on her as she calculated responses that would determine how this moment was remembered and what consequences would follow. Colonel Steele approached with movements that reflected both professional caution and growing understanding that the morning's events had revealed truths with implications far beyond a simple marksmanship competition. Her expression suggested someone who was beginning to comprehend that Dr. Samantha Rivers had never existed, that they'd been hosting someone whose true identity and capabilities belonged in classified files rather than civilian contractor records. Staff Sergeant Hawthorne stood beside his defeated assumptions, his face reflecting the profound cognitive dissonance of someone whose entire worldview had been shattered by evidence he couldn't deny or explain. Everything he'd believed about warrior superiority and civilian limitations had been challenged by performance that exceeded his own capabilities by margins that suggested different categories of human potential. The crowd waited in expectant silence for explanations that would help them process what they'd witnessed. Some searched for rational explanations that would preserve existing belief systems, while others began accepting that they'd encountered capabilities that redefined their understanding of what was possible. Alexandra touched the silver bracelet on her wrist, Mogadishu, 93, and felt the weight of inherited duty that had guided every decision throughout her career. The moment had arrived when maintaining cover would become impossible, when the choice between individual mission security and larger objectives would determine how she was remembered. When she spoke, her voice carried the quiet authority of someone who'd spent years standing between Americans and the darkness that threatened them. Someone who'd sacrificed recognition and glory for the greater good of protecting those who would never know her name. "My name is Captain Alexandra Thorne," she said, her words cutting through the desert silence with military precision. "And I think it's time we had a conversation about what real warriors look like." The revelation would change everything for everyone present, forcing them to confront truths about capability, prejudice, and the nature of service that would influence their careers and shape their understanding of what it meant to serve something greater than themselves. The desert wind continued blowing across Camp Ironclad, but the world had shifted in ways that could never be undone. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.